So good morning. Thank you to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak, and thank you for all being here this morning. So my name is Matt Lipscomb. I'm the CEO and founder of DMC Biotechnologies. And this morning, I'll be talking with you about the potential for impact through the use of biomanufacturing and the importance of scale. So there are two themes to my talk this morning. The first, I'll talk about how to get to scale efficiently and cost effectively, and how our technology was uniquely designed to do just that. And then I'll move into a few comments on the markets themselves and the products we pick and how those markets must indeed also have scale if you're going to have an impact on decarbonization. So a quick intro into the company. So we formally launched off in about 2014, though we started with some grant funding and it was largely bootstrapped for the first couple of years. My co-founder and I worked together previously at another industrial biotech company, so we lived firsthand all the experiences and challenges of scaling microbes. When that company was subsequently acquired, Mike wound up as a professor at Duke, which is where the core technology for DMC was invented. And that is the genesis of our two locations. I'm located in Boulder, Colorado, and we have a site in Durham, North Carolina as well. So the technology platform that we've developed addresses the key challenges and barriers that have plagued industrial biotech for decades now. And I'll say more about that as we go. So these concepts of predictability, robustness, and ultimately getting to scale quickly. I'll start with a few numbers. So we're excited that we've now had more than 23 patents issued globally across 6 patent families, and there are many more currently in the works on that. We've used the technology platform to demonstrate at least 5 different metabolic pathways, and that in turn opens up a broad diversity of different chemical structures that we have proven to make with the technology, so at least 9 different product chemistries, and I have a slide later that will share some of that. Through the use of our Series A funding, which it's been almost 2 years ago now, we had 3 products to pilot scale or demo scale, so 3,000 liter scale fermentation with commercial metrics, with predictability, and during that same time frame, we got our lead product to full commercial scale, again, showing predictability and consistency across a broad diversity of scales. More recently, we've launched 2 programs with corporate sponsors, with blue chip companies. Unfortunately, I can't say too much more about that, but stay tuned for some press releases later this year. And then on the team side, we were off to a little bit of a slow start last year, but in the last 2 quarters, we've actually launched to nearly 3x the size of the company we were a year ago. So we've tripled in size over the last really 2 to 3 quarters. And we're the first in the field to demonstrate predictive performance from high throughput all the way to commercial scale, independent of product or a pathway. And I'll say more about that as we go. So I'll change gears a little bit and talk about the opportunity for decarbonization and the use of biomanufacturing. So the last 2 decades, the world saw a trend towards globalization, right? So the shipment of manufacturing, or the shifting in manufacturing, mostly to Asia, right? So what came along with that was a significant increase in carbon emissions associated with that. So not the least of which is just shipping large volumes of product halfway across the globe, but also the use of fossil fuels in those regions that were critical to that manufacturing environment. More recently, the COVID-19 pandemic and the events in Eastern Europe, so the war in Ukraine, have illustrated the fragility of those same global supply chains, and we're now in the midst of a reorganization globally of those supply chains. So it used to be a handful of years ago that it was enough that you could have a couple different suppliers. But now, upstream in the value chain, those same customers are saying not only do you have to have multiple suppliers, but you have to have at least one in a different geography. And so supply chains are changing. And then the other piece that I'd like to highlight is the opportunity in chemical manufacturing. So when we think about decarbonization, the production of chemicals doesn't get much press, right? It is often overshadowed by some of the other, electrification of vehicles, by cement, by other things. But the opportunity to decarbonize how chemicals are made today is a substantial opportunity to achieve some of the decarbonization goals that the world, that countries, that companies have now committed to. And we see the opportunity for biomanufacturing is to address exactly that. So the cost-effective, local, and sustainable use of biomanufacturing, where you're locating your manufacturing close to your feedstock, so agricultural supply chains, as well as your customer. enables more of a distributed and sustainable manufacturing model. So one of the things that excites me today about this opportunity is that, unlike 2 decades ago, when the first go of industrial biotech, you're starting to see some real commitments from industry, from governments and from industry. And here's a selection of some of those. So not only are companies and governments stepping up to the challenge and setting audacious goals, so net zero by 2030, 2040, 2050, but you see companies now putting real capital towards that. And we're honored to have a number of these industrial partners around our cap table as well. So switching gears again a little bit. So so we've heard a lot about industrial biotech. It's been around for decades, but fundamentally the challenge has been it's taken too much time and too much money to get products to scale. So Lux Research put out a paper in 2015 where they reviewed the prior 15 years or so of opportunities in industrial biotech, and the number that they came up with was about 7 years and $75 million to get an idea from concept to commercial, exclusive of the cost of building a plant. And the reality is that's just too long. It's too much time, it's too much money to be able to effectively commercialize products with biotech. And so that's the challenge that we experienced firsthand in a different company and that we set out to address with DMC. So the root cause of that, we all acknowledge that engineering biology is a challenge, and where we focused our efforts was how do you create a system, both a fermentation and a microbial engineering system that creates standardization, robustness, and predictability. So remember those 3 terms, I'm going to talk more about that. So we've created the first platform in industrial biotechnology that was intentionally designed from the beginning to be able to be made to scale. So as I said, we lived this firsthand in our last company. We were in the lab and in the pilot every day, and this was something we constantly beat our head against the wall, right? So the importance of getting to scale and being able to predictively scale from high throughput all the way to commercial is game-changing for the field. So when I say standardization, that occurs on a couple of different levels. So we've standardized how we engineer the microbes, and we've done this in the context of modular and chassis-based strains. So it's very easy to reuse certain modules or parts and pieces to make different compounds of interest. But we've also standardized the fermentation process, right? And so for those of you who've worked in the field, you appreciate that oftentimes you're doing process development for every new strain and for every new scale. So from a high throughput to bench to pilot to demo to lab, oftentimes those come with endless cycles of monkeying around with process development. So the reality is that takes time and money. And every time you go to that new scale, it gets more and more expensive and more timely to reproduce what you already demonstrated at scale. So we've eliminated all that. It's one standard process. It doesn't matter what the product is. It doesn't matter what the scale it is. It always works the same. So we've eliminated those years and hundreds of millions of dollars that have historically been required for process development. So robustness is another concept that's not really talked about in the field. So the way we think about robustness is a tolerance to a much broader set of industrial conditions that you would commonly see for full commercial scale production. And that's exactly what we've been able to demonstrate now across multiple different products. And finally, standardization and robustness lead to predictability. So the idea that once we have an improvement in a strain at any scale, we are confident because we now have the data that says this will reproduce when we go to the next scale. So again, first in the field to actually demonstrate that independent of product or pathway. And so for those of you who are more visual, this is a slide that sort of gives you a hint on that, right? So in general, in our strain design and development, we generally have to do far fewer variants in terms of the screening and evaluation. Once we have an improvement that we are confident in the strain, we can take that into larger and larger scale, and we know that it's going to be predictive. And this notion of robustness is illustrated in the surface response plots. So sort of the figure with a plane, the green plane, if you will. So the idea being that across a much broader set of environmental variables, so pH, temperature, feedstock concentration, oxygen concentration, media conditions, we get the same response, right? And that's unlike a traditional system, which is depicted below, where you see much more of a contour plot, if you will. So you have highs, peaks and valleys, and that historically has been the challenge that people encountered at scale. So we've eliminated all of that. So I won't go too much into this, but if you're more technology-minded and want to have a chat, please come find me afterwards. The secret sauce of the technology we refer to as dynamic metabolic control, hence the name of the company, DMC. But very briefly, it's the combination of a standardized two-stage process where we decouple the growth of the microbe from product formation. And then in the context of that, we also effectively rewire or dynamically rewire metabolism through the select application of gene silencing and targeted proteolysis. So you can think of it as being able to achieve two separate but optimal states in time within the same set of equipment without adding anything to the environment. So again, come and find me if you want to learn more about that. But the key takeaway is here, right? Again, for those who are more visual, what you're looking for here is the curves overlay, right? So we're showing two curves here. The lower curve is the creation of the biomass, and then the curve that keeps increasing is the formation of the product. And these are showing data for our lead product, L-alanine, across 3 different scales, 3 different sites. So lab scale in Boulder and in Durham, pilot scale, we worked here in Delft. And then we worked with EW Biotech for the full commercial scale. And the important thing here is, again, these curves overlay identically within the statistical error of all the measurements. And the one final thing to highlight with this is when we worked at EW Biotech, this was in the pandemic. So we were unable to travel. We had to send them strains. We had to get on Zoom calls. And the first 2 runs out the gate, the performance hit exactly as it demonstrated in Delft and in our labs, right? And I would contrast that with, other folks have done exemplary work in the field of getting to scale, and typically it's taken them 6 months to multiple years at each different scale, and we did it the very first 2 runs out of the gate without having anyone on site, right? So the power of the technology and the competency of the 2 teams, it's hard to understate. So I mentioned it's a platform technology, so we've used the technology to make many different product chemistries and many different pathways, and a handful of those are illustrated here. So all of these types of molecules have been demonstrated using the technology at various different levels of commercial readiness. So for those of you who are more chemistry-minded, think about alcohols, diols, polyols, organic acids, amino acids, esters, and everything in the terpenoids family from monoterpene out to carotenoid, right? So the technology works very, very well for everything that we've tried. So I'll switch gears a little bit and talk a few words about markets and the importance of the scale of the market that you're trying to address. So there's been a trend in industrial biotech, synbio, over the last few years to go after very niche markets with very high selling prices. And the reason for that is very simple, right? The key performance metric that you need to achieve for a process, for a product that sells for $1,000 a kilogram is much easier than something that sells for $3 a kilogram, right? There's absolutely truth to that. But the reality is, if you really want to have an impact on decarbonization, your products need to have a certain size market, right? And you have to be able to achieve those KPMs such that you can capture enough of that market to have an impact. So perhaps the best way to illustrate this is with an example. So hypothetically, take a product that has 16 tons of CO2 mitigated per ton of product produced. And if you take that number and look at it for what I refer to as sort of a niche product, so call it $1,000 a kilogram for the product. Typically, we've done the math, we've done the research, and the price versus volume is a pretty linear correlation. So the higher the price, the lower the volume of the market. And so in this example, let's take 20 tons per year. This is representative. We actually have some examples of this. So you have a relatively small total addressable market, or TAM, right? But more importantly, you can really only offset about 300 tons or so of CO2 if you capture the entirety of that market, right? And so to put that in perspective, most of the people in this room could offset more than 300 tons of CO2 per year just by reducing their air travel, right? So if you really want to have an impact on decarbonization, you can't go after just these niche markets, right? You have to go after something with a real market volume. It doesn't have to be a commodity, right? So for example, take something with a $3 per kilogram selling price that maybe has 50,000 tons per year of total market volume. So if you capture that, now you're talking about offsetting 800,000 plus tons of CO2 per year, right? So the other final note, going back to that niche market, so there was a conversation yesterday about what's suitable for a VC investment, right? So seed investors these days are looking for the potential for $1 billion return, right? So if you're going after niche markets and your TAM is only a $20 million for that product, you're going to have to reproduce that 50 times, right? So yeah, it's nice, you can get that first win, but now you got to do it 49 more times to get an exit that's VC appropriate, that makes the VC math work. So it's something else to think about. So the unique selling propositions that we've confirmed with multiple customers and multiple partners really are delivering across economics, so attractive economics, improving supply chain resiliency, so being able to have those regional and distributed manufacturing that's uniquely enabled by fermentation, and providing a sustainability benefit. In the case of our lead product, alanine, we forecasted more than a 90% reduction in CO2 emissions compared to the incumbent petrochemical-based process, and more than a 40% reduction for the incumbent fermentation-based process. So with that, I will pause, and I think Catherine's going to join me on stage.
Do you want me to take that?
Yeah, great.
All right, thank you, Matt. That was a great introduction to DMC Biotechnologies. And I have the opportunity now to grill you and ask you some questions. And we're also going to give the audience a chance to come with some questions in a bit. If you have something, then please prepare it. And we'll have a mic that goes around later. So you talked about the technology being made to scale. And scale and speed are really big issues traditionally in this sector. So what we see is that most big companies and most consumer goods companies are making pledges and targets about net zero, about sustainability, as you said, 2030, 2040, 2050. But why is it taking so long, do you think?
So a couple reasons from my perspective. So part of it is certainly it's a commentary on the magnitude of the challenge, right? We're talking about rethinking the way we make everyday products, from the shoes and the clothes that we wear, to the materials that make up our cars and airplanes. So that's a big problem, right? That's a monstrous opportunity and a challenge. And the petrochemical industry has had a 170-year head start. So it's a monstrous challenge that we're now rising to. And then, historically, I think, or at least in the last few decades, incentives haven't necessarily been aligned, right? So I mentioned in my talk, a couple decades ago, the first wave of industrial biotech, you sort of had tepid support as long as oil prices were a certain level. But now you're starting to see those change, right? So you're starting to see regulatory support. For example, in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act. In Europe, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So the governments are stepping up. You have regulatory support. Consumers are demanding it. You're starting to see, the chemical companies are starting to step up. So that's moving up the supply chain. And I think the other piece of that is, historically incentives haven't necessarily been aligned, right? By that I mean, many big companies today they have to meet their quarterly earnings statement, right? And so that is not necessarily compatible with investing for the long term, and that's really what we're talking about. Is how do you invest real capital for the long term to make change?
It feels like there are a lot of aspects of the system that need to change.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So you said customers are demanding it, the regulators are starting to get on board. What about the financial markets? You touched on that briefly.
So I think we're headed in that direction, right? I think as I reflect back on history, right, if you think about, what enabled, the US to become a powerhouse in tech, right, in sort of the 90s and 2000s. And if you look back the decades prior to that, if you think about what enabled those companies like Xerox PARC or the Bell Labs and some of their skunkwork programs, what incentivized them to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in these technology platforms that would eventually, over the next 2 decades, come to create an entirely new revolution in how the world operates, so the internet, right? But what enabled that, or what incentivized those investments such that the private sector actually invested for the long term? Right? And that's the opportunity before us, I think.
Yeah. And on sustainability-focused things, there's something around externalities. So the environmental costs from the damage, they don't get passed on to the companies. They tend to get picked up by the taxpayer or the government. I mean, that's also a structural issue in how the systems are organized today.
That's exactly right. So if you think about, I think of it as sort of the extractive industries are very good at pushing off negative externalities or costs onto the taxpayer, right? So as one somewhat tangential example, I'm from Colorado, so mining is still quite a thing in Colorado, and every handful of years, we see another example of where a mining company comes in, they create massive lagoons of waste, and they just leave, and they go out of business and just leave the waste for the taxpayers to pick up, right? It's been the same thing with the petroleum companies, right, who've pushed off the adverse impacts of CO2 emissions, even though they've known about it since the 70s. Right, and so I think this carbon border adjustment mechanism is sort of the first attempt to actually allocate costs to the actual producers who are incurring them instead of pushing them off on the public.
Yeah,
so.
The indirect and direct subsidies really need to stop.
Yeah.
We talked about speed a little bit and scale a little bit. What other challenges do you see today for the biomaterials market?
So at least in the realm of fermentation, I think we've all heard and participated in the conversation around the limitation of large-scale capacity, right? So there is a capacity crunch in large-scale fermentation assets available today, and so there is going to be a significant capital expense to catch back up, if you will, or to build this new capacity. I think we've been very fortunate. We've been able to identify the right partners at the right scales, and so I think of it as sort of two different challenges. So I think there are many different opportunities if you just need to do technology demonstration. So if you need to go to 3,000-ish liter scale, if you need to go to 85,000-ish liter scale, prove that the technology works, make some material to create samples for customers. I think there are opportunities for that, but I'm really talking about sort of the next scale when you really want to get into large scale, so thousands of tons per year, routine campaign manufacturing. Those assets largely are just simply not available.
Is that there's the capacity crunch that we've heard people talking about?
That's exactly right.
So it feels like biomanufacturing is now getting a bit more attention and positive attention after, you could say, perhaps some waves of hype in the last decade or two. Now that we're getting that attention, what do you think needs to change? I mean, to some extent, we need to deliver on our promises, but I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
So the industry definitely needs some wins, for sure.
We're looking at all of you.
The industry does have some wins, for sure, right? If you think about the successes in, the lactic acid, the 1,4-butanediol, 1,3-PDO, there are some successes, but we really need more of those. And they need to come faster and more efficiently, for sure.
And we need to take care around any hype that we might be generating as companies, because we do need to deliver on what we're promising.
That's exactly right. And I think one of the trends that I see in the field today has been there's a lot of emphasis on getting to a minimum viable product, right? So it's sort of this notion that comes out of Silicon Valley and tech, and we can make a little vial, or we can make a thin film that's this big. Those make for really pretty pictures. They get people excited. That's great. But I think what's missing is the plan to get from that minimum viable product to what comes next, right? So you really have to be able to show a credible path, credible on the biology, on the thermodynamics, on the kinetics of what needs to happen to get from here to there, right? Because biology can do many amazing things, but it's not a question of what biology can do, it's what biology can do at a price point at which a customer is going to pay for it.
Yeah, it has to make commercial sense, as well as being, something very exciting to come out of the lab. It has to hit performance metrics and commercial metrics. And it's really interesting because the things that are hyped, especially if they don't succeed, they are then, impacting the confidence that everyone else in the sector can get, and that's impacting the availability of finance. And you touched on the capacity crunch, and if we are to really move this forward quickly, which is what's needed, there needs to be an influx of capital.
Absolutely.
And where are we going to get that from? How's that going to work?
That's a great question. So I'm definitely encouraged, like I said, by the regulatory support. So certainly in the US and in Europe, there's lots of public money that is being deployed towards this. The IRA, at least in biomanufacturing, is, the executive order was released last fall, and we're just now coming through that promulgation cycle where it's come through committees, and you're starting to see some real dollars and actually be deployed, which is great. The carbon border adjustment mechanism is coming in, but in EU and the Green Deal in EU, there's already capital being deployed, substantial capital for non-dilutive investments, which is fantastic. But I think private equity or private capital is going to need to be leveraged as well, right? So we mentioned it earlier. So how do you incentivize? You have some of these very large corporate players with very, very healthy balance sheets, and so getting them to bring money to the table and step up will be a critical part of this as well.
So we can't only rely on venture capital at one end of the scale and public money at the other. And we've seen, with the public money, we have seen that political opinions can change. Have been U-turns around biofuels. Many people in this industry have also been burned by that. So the public money is important, but it's not the only option. I don't think we want to be dependent on public funding entirely.
Yeah, absolutely.
It has to make commercial sense. It has to stand on its own 2 feet commercially.
Absolutely.
Okay. So what are your thoughts for the sector in general? We've touched on some of the issues, some of the challenges, and it is going to take time to raise investment and to build the capacity that we need. But what would your best case scenario be for the industrial biotech sector? In terms of impact, I'm thinking.
So like I said, I'm cautiously optimistic, and I'm much more excited than I was, a decade ago, right? I think, there's a lot of favorable winds, right? So they're the winds at our back, which is nice for a change, instead of winds in our face. Technology continues to advance, and sort of the tools that are available, broadly available to the industry at large, are fantastic. You're starting to see, the governments are really committing. The strategics are really stepping up. Like I said, not just with hand-waving goals, but they're putting real capital. I can't share the details, but I can say we've experienced this firsthand, right? They're putting real capital at play, and you're genuinely trying to make an impact. And so I think, like I said, I'm much more excited than I was a decade ago.
That's great. And how does DMC fit within that pretty picture?
So I think if I could wave my magic wand, right, I'm sort of fond of that old Intel commercial, right? The Intel Inside, where all your chips were made by Intel. I think that's the grand opportunity for DMC, right? DMC Inside, the tech inside, the biotech that enables scale up for all these different products.
And there's a reputation element to that too, because Intel, it meant something, right? So that the DMC or that the biotech technology inside the finished products, the consumer doesn't need to know what ingredients go into the shampoo or the pot of paint or whatever, but that there's some trust, and that there's a reputation of solidity and sustainability around the sector. Fantastic. Well, you also have an opportunity to ask Matt some questions. I don't want to do all of the talking. We have a microphone. Susanna is at the back with a microphone. So could you please just raise your hand if you'd like to ask something? Don't be shy. We do still have a few minutes. If not, I will keep going. Yeah, the gentleman in the front, please. And if you could just a brief question so that we give chance for the reply.
Yes. You talked about DMC Inside, and your lead product now is L9. So what will be your next product, and will you launch own products, or will you rely on partners to ask you to develop products?
That's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah. So it's a question we get asked frequently. What's your business model? It's always nice to be if you can bucket a company in sort of one bucket or another. Unfortunately, that's not that simple, right? So we take a portfolio approach to not only the products but also how we do business. And so I think it really is all the above. So alanine is an example, right, where we've done the technology development, we have the customers lined up, we're sorting through the manufacturing operation. So that's more of a sort of build, own, operate, classical model, if you will. But I think the importance of working with partners can't be understated. And so with the technology platform, something that we can point in many different directions, working with partners is a great opportunity, and this is something we're actively seeking to do more of, right? So with the way I think about getting a product to market, you need 3 big buckets. You need technology, you need the ability to manufacture it, and you need the confirmed market, right? And so we obviously excel on the technology side. But to the extent that a partner wants to come to us and say, hey, we've got this product and we've confirmed the market, and we will commit on the manufacturing side, either we have the manufacturing asset or we'll build it, right? So they bring 2 out of the 3 things that you need, and that's a great win for us as well. So I think we evaluate it on a case-by-case basis, and we're looking for the path of least resistance to get commercial product as quickly as possible.
I feel like when I first came into this industry, like 10, 15 years ago, it was all about putting steel in the ground. Yep. And a lot of people got burned because they were so focused on, we've got our first plant and we've got our next plant. Like what you're describing there is a lot more flexible in terms of approach. That seems more fitting for where we are today as an industry.
Absolutely, right. So we've taken an approach from the beginning on trying to be capital light and not deploy too much capital too fast. That's definitely a lesson learned from the first generation. and leveraging partners' expertise, right? So we'll be the first to admit we're not experts in building, owning, and operate plants, right? So let's leverage the right partners' expertise to get that done in a way that makes sense. I think the other nice thing that it gives us as a platform company is it gives us, like I said, a different risk profile, right? So if you think back to sort of the 2000s, largely it was one product, one company, and if anything changed, if you couldn't hit the technology metrics or if the market shifted, everything was kind of you were kind of done, right? And so the fact that we have multiple products, multiple markets, multiple business models gives us a little more robustness to the unknown.
Yep. Indeed. I hope that we answered your question. Anybody else? We have a little time if you'd still like to ask. At the back, in the very back. Hi.
Yeah, otherwise you need to shout enough. Thank you for the nice presentation and also the focus on actually the need for making impact with the CO2. I was wondering, you were talking about development of internet and the radical innovation there. I was wondering, do you think there's enough radical innovation in our field? And if not, what needs to happen to make it happen more?
So is there enough innovation in the field, and what is needed to have more innovation?
Well, more radical innovation.
More radical innovation.
Making the big changes.
Okay,
yeah.
Great.
I mean, the state of biotechnology is changing rapidly. If I think about the last 2 decades, right, the Human Genome Project was just completed in 2000, right, and that set the stage for the evolution or the revolution in the cost of DNA reading and writing, right. So I think what's different about DMC, and I think where the field could use more support or more direction, is in sort of this integrated systems approach to how you engineer biology, right? So many times today people come with sort of one tool that addresses sort of one piece of what you need. So if you think about the need to engineer a microbe, so genetic or genomic engineering, protein engineering, pathway engineering, most startups sort of focus on just one of those pieces, but the reality is you kind of need it all. So you need all of those 3 things, plus you need fermentation, plus you need DSP, plus you need techno-economic modeling, and you need all of those things to work seamlessly well together. And so if you think about by comparison, like NASA putting a rocket on the moon, right? They don't just think about telemetry or astrophysics or material science. They think about all of them, and they all have to come together at the right time in order to get that rocket on the moon, right? And that's kind of how we think about engineering biology. So you need all of these things, all of them to work together seamlessly and to advance the most critical problems that you may be having. Right? Maybe it's a strain engineering problem, maybe it's a DSP engineering problem, maybe it's a protein engineering problem, maybe it's fermentation, maybe it's scale. But I think there's an opportunity to think more systems-based approach to how we engineer biology.
Does that make sense? Any more questions? And you got a question? All right, Paul. Can we have the microphone at the front, please, for Paul?
Hi, Paul MacDonald, World Biomarkets.
Yeah, we know who you are.
Can't see me in the back. Matt, question. I sort of know, but I don't know if everybody else knows, because I interviewed you a couple of years ago, right? So about your inspiration behind DMC. Yep. And I was talking at dinner last night about the societal or planetal inspiration behind a number of sort of businesses like yours, right? And I'm wondering whether, as the commercial opportunity in this space increases, the goodness inspiration decreases. And maybe what your thoughts are around that. Are new entrants, do they have the same sort of values as you, for example?
Interesting.
So I obviously can't really speak for others in the field. I know for Mike and I and sort of how we think about it, we both worked in pharma for a while. We have exposure there, and our previous experience at OPX. So not only did we experience sort of the challenges of engineering biology, but I think we also left somewhat unfulfilled. So I think there is this enormous potential for biology to do good, both in terms of business, but sort of morally values-based, decarbonization. I just don't think we've realized it yet for the industrial setting, right? So obviously coming out of COVID and the rapid deployment of vaccines, I think people don't really appreciate that there was actually 15 plus years of those RNA vaccines before we kind of launched into this. But people sort of experience firsthand, like, well, we can rapidly deploy biotech to make vaccines, and people get vaccinated all the time, right? But I think there's a parallel opportunity in industrial biotech. It's just a much harder challenge, right? And so I think when when OPX was acquired by Cargill, that was great. It was a win, right? It was a win for the technology and for the team. But it still felt like there was work left undone, and I think that's kind of what's driving us, is how do you really solve these problems in engineering biology and point them at things that can make a big difference in the world, so decarbonizing chemicals.
I feel like you're almost asking, does there need to be a values connection when companies are operating in this space? Something along those lines as well, I feel, in what you're asking. So it's like doing business and making a difference. Is it necessary that there's the making a difference element? I mean, I would say yes, but...
I would agree. So for me, I also think of it as, this is hard. This is hard work.
Yeah.
So, I know the media portrays, the startup CEO as this rock star lifestyle. Like, I'm not a rock star. It's a lot of hard work, right?
Well, it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah, exactly. Day in and day out. And so having something else, to sort of that drives you other than sort of finance or whatever, I think it really helps keep the fire alive, if you will, right? This potential to leave a lasting impression. Right?
And I think it's what helps you build a really great team as well. I mean, you say you tripled your team in a year.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's also what brings people into a business and makes them want to show up every day and do their best work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's been we've been through this a couple times now. So the previous company, when we went from sort of low double digits to 40-ish people or so, we didn't put nearly enough time and emphasis on culture and values, and that was a disaster. Like, I swore to myself I would never do that again. And so now we've just come through that same cycle with DMC, and the team is just firing. I mean, it's amazing to see how well the group is working together. I mean, we have our problems like any relationship does, right? But just being mindful of that culture and those values, and hiring people who are broadly diverse in terms of every other aspect, but come together on common values and how we work together and how we collaborate has made I just can't say enough good things about what the team has brought in that regard. So
there were some videos online from the DMC team, like some short interviews, and almost all of them say, we feel listened to, we feel like our voice matters here. Yeah. And that's really so striking when we have certain impressions of how business is done today. So I think the values element is really key.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. We could perhaps take one more if anybody's got something they'd like to ask Matt. And yeah, thank you, the gentleman in the middle.
Hi, I'm Vago. I'm an intern at ADM. I just had one question. What would be a key piece of information for someone who is new to the industry?
So sort of a motivation, or what should you know? What would you... A key piece of information for someone starting out in the industry. That's a great question. Yeah. What would your one pearl of wisdom be? Not putting you on the spot now or anything.
So I would recommend. So there was an old adage in grad school, right, about a week in the library would save you a month in the lab or something like that. So this field is now old enough that there is a history. And we're even seeing this with some of our newer employees, people coming out of school for the first time. There's sort of a lack of appreciation of what has come before, right? And so my piece of advice would be take the time, whether it's through research at the library or finding a mentor, to really understand what has come before. Because there has been a lot of really good work, for sure, and there are a lot of lessons to be learned. And as the old adage goes, if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. So I would say take the time to learn what has all the good work and all the lessons of those who've come before.
And that seems like a perfect place to finish. Matt Lipscomb, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.